Hi, Mike. How are you doing?
I'm good, Darwin. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. I've been looking forward to this conversation for ever since the spending review last week, really, because I think it's quite nice a week or so on from it to actually kind of dig down into the detail of the spending review rather than just focusing on the immediate media headlines. So I guess a good place for us to start really is what did you make of the spending review last week?
Well, we've discussed this several times before, Darwin, obviously, but my view is that this country is facing a serious public spending problem. In fact, I'd almost describe it as a crisis. But to listen to what Rachel Reeves has said in both of her budget statements and also now in this spending review, you'd hardly know it. She seems almost oblivious to the problems we're actually facing on the spending side. So overall, I would give that spending review pretty low marks. We can come into some of the detail of the thing, but I just didn't think it confronted the issues we've got at all.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think we'll touch on this later on in this conversation, but kind of the way I just thought of it is we had a budget last year which was supposed to be cleaning up the mess that they described that they got from the previous Conservative administration. And then they seem to be treating this spending review as if we were back at kind of base zero, really. And so we can start spending all of a sudden in preparation for a budget later this year. And I was going through this hefty report that they provided us with. It's long enough in detail, but what I didn't really see throughout it really is much of a message of what the government's trying to particularly achieve with this. There were kind of big benefits for the health service, for example, from this. But outside of that, some of the targeted spending, which is actually going to see returns for the taxpayer, weren't made right now. And so I'm not really sure what the strategy of the government is. But kind of focusing on that spending point first, really. You mentioned spending's far too high. I was going through the OBR's data bank, which kind of, as you'll know, houses all of this data that we all use so much to track how the tax burden's doing and spending and so on. And I was having a look, and kind of before 2000, it seemed to be that we were kind of roughly around about 36% of GDP was being spent on total managed expenditure, as they put it. But ever since it was kind of 2006 and onwards, really, it's spiked up to 40%, and then more recently up to I think 44%. It's meant to sustainably be at. What do you think about that? Because for me, I just think without kind of targeted plans to actually reduce that burden, I don't really see how we can sustain that as a country with the current tax burden we have.
Well, as you say, Darwin, back at the turn of the millennium, spending was running at around 35% of GDP, which is a sustainable long-term level for reasons we can talk about. But it's now moved up closer to 45%, which is a huge increase. And I think what we've seen is obviously the operation of that traditional public spending ratchet. We saw the obviously the 2008 financial crash, and governments, it wasn't just our government, but governments around the world stepped in to some extent to try and bail the system out. And then we saw, of course, the COVID problem, which was exacerbated in terms of the economy and a whole lot of other things by the lockdowns that we had. So both of those things boosted spending here. They boosted spending in the overseas, in comparable countries around the world. But we never saw in the aftermath of those splurges, we never really saw a serious attempt to bring the spending totals back down again. And if you look at the teens, 2010 onwards up to COVID, basically, GDP in this country grew in every single year. And yet, although in fairness, Cameron and Osborne did actually do something, it was called austerity, and they got a lot of flack for it to try and hold the growth of spending back a bit, and they did have some success. But there was never the kind of scale of attempt that we needed to get on top of spending. And I think the other point is that although all countries around the world, or all the developed countries, have seen spending percentages increase, percentage of GDP, just like we've done, we have got one of the biggest of anywhere in the world. Because if you compare us with the G7, our spending percentage of GDP has gone up by 10% of GDP. That's far bigger than any other one. In fact, it's three times the average increase across comparable countries. So we've done particularly badly, and we don't seem to have managed to reverse those ratchets. There's been a little bit of reversal, but on a kind of long-term basis, we just haven't had it.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at the data and kind of you saw in previous splurges, obviously after the Second World War, you saw the massive tax or the massive spike in spending as well. But you did see over the long term that reduced down to that 35% level that we mentioned. And I actually saw, I think it was in 2018-19 and then 2019-20, spending had actually come down to just below 40% of GDP as well. But as you say, it seems to be that the politicians don't want to take decisive action in better times per se to bring
No.
spending down. And then that makes us so much more susceptible the next time another crisis comes around. I mean, as you mentioned, we had the 2008 financial crisis. Then kind of the Cameron Osborne era kind of stabilized spending, but it didn't significantly reduce it. And then we're susceptible to when the COVID pandemic happened. And then after that as well, we then had the energy crisis caused by the conflict in
Yeah,
Ukraine
there
as
was that
well.
as well, of course. Yeah.
And so, what I'd be interested in is kind of 2 points from you, Mike, really on this as well. Is kind of, do you think it's ever going to be possible for us to bring this down? Because if our current kind of clique of politicians don't actually take the action in the good times to bring it down, then it's going to constantly go up. And even if it might stabilize now at 44%, then it will go up again to, let's say, 48% the next time a crisis comes around.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that is a very serious problem. I mean, you put your finger on the fundamental problem here. We've got politicians who find it almost impossible to take the sort of decisions that are needed in order to get a grip on spending. And we can understand why. I mean, we've got the democratic electoral cycles in all of these countries. And I'm pretty certain it was Jean-Claude Juncker, who's not one of my favorite people, who made the point years ago that, in terms of European politicians, we all know what we need to do, but the problem is we don't know how to get re-elected afterwards once we've done it. And
Yeah.
I think that is a bit of a problem. I mean, my view on this is that, actually, and this is an awful thing to say, I don't think we're going to be able to address the spending problem without a major fiscal and economic crisis. And I take no pleasure in saying that. But I'm really, really old, Darwin, and I remember the 1970s very well.
Mm.
And that's really what it took. When the Callahan government in 1976, in the aftermath of the sterling and gilt market crisis, at that point, which was caused largely, there were other factors going on, but spending was far too high. When they came in to make serious spending cuts. It was very, very difficult, even though everyone could see there was a major crisis. And they actually implemented the biggest kind of year-on-year spending cut that we've had since the Second World War. I mean, it was pretty serious stuff, and they did it, and they did the right thing. I mean, another point one might make is that when you look at they weren't my kind of, I didn't agree with a lot of their political views, but these were serious guys. I
Mm.
mean, the Chancellor, Dennis Healey, had been an Oxford scholar at Balliol College, so he was a bright guy, and he was a tough guy. He'd been a beach master at Anzio. These were serious people. And
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but you look at somebody like Rachel Reeves and you sort of think, she's never going to get a grip on something like this. So I'm a bit of a pessimist, I'm afraid, Darwin. I think we're going to have to go through a serious crisis before we manage to get a grip on it.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of. It's difficult to disagree with you on that. I try and be a permanent optimist whenever I can, but the thing is that one of the things that kind of really illustrates that point about Rachel Reeves not being kind of the serious Labour Chancellor that you mentioned in the past that we may have had with Dennis Healey as an example is the fact that I don't think she mentioned once in her speech actually the debt, which obviously is the consequence of all of this mammoth spending that she's actually doing. And again, I was having a look at the figures, and even before the statement was made, public sector net debt was 95% of GDP when she stood up, and it's still going to stay at that level and actually increase gradually towards 100%. And I was kind of looking at some information that the Wall Street Journal did on US debt, to be fair, but I think it applies over here as well, in that their debt is also ballooning as well, and they were saying the debt interest payments on that, as soon as debt as a percentage of GDP becomes up to close to 175% of GDP, then it actually becomes unsustainable for the interest payments to actually even be able to be made to be paid. And so we're effectively, as you say, getting a bit towards a doom spiral now where we're constantly spending, which is constantly adding to our debt, which is adding to our debt interest, which is ultimately going to be ended up not being able to be paid because we won't be able to increase taxes enough to even be able to pay off the debt that we owe.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, debt interest at the moment is running in excess of 100 billion a year, which is a huge amount of money. I mean, we'll come back to some of the big numbers because I think a lot of people, including me, have difficulty wrapping their heads around just how big some of these numbers are. But it's over 100 billion a year, which, if you work it out on a per household basis, is about 4 grand a year. You know, it's serious, serious money. And in effect, what we're doing is we're borrowing at the moment is running between 4 and 5% of GDP, annual borrowing. We're borrowing to pay the interest on the debt, which is, as anyone who's ever had a credit card knows, that's really, really bad to do that. But that is what we're doing. And, that is a problem. And, as you say, the debt ratio at the moment, public sector borrowing as a percentage of GDP is about 95%, and it's heading up towards 100%. But of course, the OBR, and we've all got different views about whether they're any good or not. I actually think they do a relatively professional job, personally. They produce long-term forecasts as well as their sort of short-term forecasts. They call it the Fiscal Sustainability Report because they're trying to work out whether our fiscal policies, as they stand at the moment, given the outlook for economic growth, given the outlook for our aging population and so on, whether that actually is sustainable over the long term. And their latest forecast, which was produced before Rachel got to work increasing spending even more, so that's an important point to make. Their latest forecasts say that, but they take them out to 50 years. And they basically say that the debt ratio by that point will be around 300%. It'll be close to 300% in 50 years' time. Okay. So I'll be gone. So it's not my problem. You're probably still going to be around, Darwin. So it
I'll be
is
saying the
your
same things
problem.
you're saying right now all over again.
You will be. And you'll have grey hair as well. And yeah, so they say 300%. That's their central forecast, but their central forecast is rather optimistic about economic growth in Britain, I think. And if you look at one of their downside scenarios, which to me seems more like a central forecast, it actually isn't 300%, it's 600%, which is obviously completely crackers, and we're never going to reach there, which is why I say I'm afraid we're heading for a crisis at some point before then.
Yeah, and I think it's actually starting to seem like we're going to need the public really to take this on before our political leaders are really willing to engage with the debate. I mean, we, as you'll know, Mike, do loads of work on the debt. We've got our debt clock, which is alive, ticking up as we speak, to show what the
Yeah,
debt is going up every single second. But I think when you actually talk to members of the public about this, they cannot believe the amount of money that is at stake here, and that is being simply thrown away by the government just on paying off the debt on
yeah,
its own. And I mean, we used to talk about debt interest, and it's not in and of itself a bad thing to run a national debt. That's not a
no,
negative thing. No one's calling
no,
for zero debt. But when you're
no.
getting to debt interest payments in real terms being consistently over £100 billion, I mean, you've got to think of the other big ticket spending items the government has. I mean, that's only really much below health and welfare in terms of total spending. And kind
Yeah,
of, and I don't think voters, I mean, obviously they don't have the time to be looking at this all the
no.
time, but I don't think if you were to actually show them, as we do all the time, that this is one of the largest top five spending areas that the government has, that this is where they think their money and their taxpayers' money is actually going at the end of the day. But ultimately, if our political leaders aren't going to take the issue on, then it's going to have to be led by organisations such as us and the general public as well in order to actually get the issue through. Because otherwise, it's going to, as you say, rely on an organisation like the IMF coming in, which I'm sure
Yeah.
none of us want to happen, but it's going to have to happen if we're going to get on top of this.
Well, indeed. And Darwin, I mean, just to put that back to you again, I mean, what we've been talking about is the official national debt. Now, I know you and your guys have produced a regular report on the real national debt. Maybe you could just update us on that.
Sure. I mean, I almost want to tear my hair out reminding myself of that release because the numbers when we get to that are just astronomical. I mean, the real national debt, as you say, Mike, is kind of not the official numbers that the OBR and the government recognise, but it takes account of some of these big liabilities that the government has, but which aren't accounted for in the current national debt figures. And so what we include in that is, yes, the current public sector net debt, but then we also include state pension liabilities, which obviously the government is going to have to pay out, and also public sector pension liabilities as well, which again, they're obligated to pay to civil servants and other public sector workers. And then when we throw in all of that together, the debt goes from about 2.7 trillion, which is what it currently is according to the government, to up to 12 trillion by our latest estimate. And so when we're actually talking about these numbers, and I think this is what we try and do as well as an organization, is highlight these figures to the public, but also to the government as well. When you're taking account of all of these liabilities it has, the debt is even more unaffordable than the government is willing to recognize right now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean that's absolutely right, and it's very scary when you start doing those sorts of calculations. And of course, one of the things you realize is that the government, and when we say the government, what we mean is taxpayers.
Yeah.
You know, taxpayers are not going to be able to pay these debts off in one way or another. They just aren't, because we've already seen from what Rachel and, in fairness, the previous Tory government had done in terms of raising taxes. When you raise taxes, it isn't just bad news for taxpayers because we have to pay more money to the government. It's bad news for the economy as well. It depresses economic activity. It undermines entrepreneurship, cuts private sector investment, and all those things. And you know, you don't need much of a spreadsheet and to work out that within a few years that you know the wheels come off. It's as simple as that. And that's without taking account of the fact that the gilt market, the so-called bond vigilantes, you know, have saddled up again, and they are now circling around. And we've already seen quite a big step up in bond yields, not just here, but you know, around the world. Because of course, all governments, all the big sovereign borrowers,
Yeah.
they're all heavily indebted, and they're all trying to borrow in this pool of capital. And bond investors are getting rather nervous about it because they're looking at things like default, inflation rising. So I mean, without going down that rabbit hole too far, basically, bond yields, the cost of government borrowing, has spiked up enormously from what it was in 5, 6 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, and I think sometimes kind of economists in the media can kind of make things more complicated than they necessarily need to be. As you say, governments want to borrow money. Obviously, people that are happy to borrow or lend them that money are going to expect a return on that. And the thing is, the more that the government requires from them, it ultimately means there's less money for those that are lending them to actually invest in the productive part of the economy, which is the private sector, which
Absolutely.
and it's been successive governments that we've seen, both Conservative and Labour, which have said we want to get growth in this economy. But we've seen successive governments, no matter the colour of them, continuing to borrow more and more and more without realising the consequences that's having on their core mission to actually grow the economy. And I think going back to kind of the spending review and Rachel Reeves, like this review has made the situation yet worse because we're seeing real terms increases in kind of departmental expenditure limits, which for our audience who aren't aware, that's effectively the government's spending on departments and public spending as a whole, really, for the next 3 or 4 financial years. That's going up by 2.3% in real terms. So they're actually increasing the amount that they're actually going to do.
Yeah, that's right. And that's going to increase the percentage of the economy, as it were, taken up by public spending instead of being available for private activities. That's absolutely right. And I think it's very interesting. So I mean, focusing in now on Rachel's spending review,
Yeah.
you know, so I've had a go at reading it as well. I haven't got the paper version, but I've got an online version. And it is like wading through treacle. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there and a lot of kind of spin in there as well. It's a political document. I mean, they haven't done a bad job, but there's a lot of sort of guff, political padding in there. And as you say, the bottom line is that the real terms increase is about 2.3%, which is faster than the likely growth of the economy. I mean, this year the official forecast is sort of one-ish, and that might not actually come about. So so that's one thing. And there's also the issue of how they've divvied it up between the different departments. So the biggest increase in spending terms is the health service.
Yeah.
Now, you know, we all understand that the health service can take infinite amounts of money, and we might come back to, you know, what we might do about that later on. But so the health service. Now, however you look at it, I mean, all right, we all want healthcare, but it's not what you would call an investment in the productive side of the economy. So, I mean, okay, that's the biggest chunk of money. I think they're getting an extra 50 billion over the period per annum. And then the biggest percentage increase goes to Ed Miliband's energy department. And we are going to become what is it? A low carbon superpower or something. I can't remember.
Doesn't it fill you with excitement? Yeah.
It doesn't fill me with excitement. It fills me with horror because, the money that we're putting into that is not economically productive. All of that stuff, it's expensive forms of energy. I know people have got different views, but every time I've looked at the detail of it, that you're talking about switching from a cheap form of energy to an expensive form of energy. And I don't see how that makes any sense from an economic point of view. Might save the planet, might do, although, we all know our carbon emissions are low, but it's not an economically productive thing. Now, the other thing they did do, I mean, when you look through the document as a whole, as you will have seen, they highlight what they're trying to do. They do set out a kind of strategy, and one of the items they highlight is security. So they are spending a bit more on defense, but I mean, a lot of people who know more about defense than I know say it's not nearly enough still. So there is a bit more on defense. The Home Office, which of course is responsible for policing, doesn't seem to have done at all well. So I don't know how that fits in with security. Second area they talk about is economic growth, building economic growth. Now, in fairness to them, Rachel Reeves has changed the balance within the budget totals between the growth of current spending and the growth of capital spending. So by the end of the period, the capital spending element of these departmental expenditure limits has gone up to about 21%
Yep.
from the current 19%. So she has actually put some more money in investment, and they're hanging a lot of hope on that. When we talk about, you said, well, what are they doing to improve economic growth? Public investment is something they're very, very keen on emphasizing, that this is going to provide growth. And in the OBR's first budget forecast for them last October, they actually factored in some element for this increased emphasis on growth. So they've given them some growth credit
Yeah.
for the increase in investment. And basically, the OBR say that if you increase investment, public sector investment, by 1 percentage point of GDP on a sustained basis, then over the long term, the level of GDP in the economy will go up by about 2.5%. That's their central estimate, right? It takes a very long time to do it, first off. But the problem with it is that the research evidence they've used to reach that conclusion, research evidence elsewhere, is very, very mixed. And some of it goes back to the point that you made earlier on. One of the studies that they used basically says that more public investment will crowd out private investment to the same extent over time, partly through the effect on interest rates that you just talked about. So, this is the problem. They're taking money out of the really productive side of the economy and putting it into things that maybe will contribute something, but the cost is too high.
Yeah, exactly. And I think kind of going back on the capital spending point that you mentioned as well, kind of one of Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules was to loosen the capital budgets, of course, and she's clearly done that in this review. And kind of I'm sure we're both all for capital spending when we can actually see what the return's going to be for that. But as you say, kind of defence spending, I support more defence spending, of course. But the thing is that the track record of defence spending is not great. It's kind of procurement disasters. I mean, we've done research at the Taxpayers Alliance before where projects are delayed and there's cost overruns. And so how effective that spending is actually going to be is going to be kind of the real important point that they need to drill down on, not just we're putting this amount of billions in, which they do with a lot of projects, to be fair, including the health service as well. They always say how much they're putting in. They never really talk about what we're getting in return for that. But then also their area as well of social housing as well. Kind of one of the big points that was trailed and was announced during the speech was, I think, an extra £39 billion to be spent on social housing. But the thing is, when it comes to housing, the way I fundamentally think of this is, why are we not having the incentives in there for the government not to have to produce this? Why have we not got the appropriate incentives in there for private sector house builders to actually come in and do it themselves and actually be able to make money out of it as well? But again, it seems to be the case that for every problem that they're running into, such as the fact of a lack of housing, they go, the great idea is we're really good at delivering things at government at the minute. So what we'll do is actually we'll deliver it as well, and we'll definitely be able to build 1.5 million homes, I think is the pledge, but in this parliament. And it is just unbelievable the amount of amount of taxpayers' money, we should say, we should keep reminding our listeners that it's taxpayers' money going in, that they're committing to this, when ultimately what they should be doing is cutting regulation where possible and actually providing tax relief as well, so that then we can incentivize those house builders to do it themselves, so then we're not relying on taxpayers to yet stump up further money in order to pay for it.
Well, that's a very, very good point, Darwin. The government, and it's not just this government, in fairness,
Yeah.
successive governments we've had seem to have an unbelievable belief in their own ability to do these things, despite masses of evidence to the contrary. And on this issue of investment, well, I mean, one might argue whether investment in social housing is actually going to deliver much of an economic return. I can see you could make some argument that it will be some, but how much we don't know. But, one of the problems with the OBR's sort of estimates of how much this additional capital spending will pay off in terms of growth, is that it does depend so much on what type of capital spending you're putting it into. So capital spending on things like, well, let's say old people's homes that I might need one soon. So, we might need it, but you couldn't really say there's going to be a lot of economic return. Capital spending on hospitals, for example. Well, again, we need them, but it's more of a social thing than an economic thing. That's the way I think about it. It's something that you can afford when you've got a buzzing economy, when the economy's moving, but you need the growth first. But the other thing is, even when we put money in, or when governments put money into things that are supposed to have an economic payoff, first of all, there's the whole issue of procurement that you're talking about. There are then massive budget overruns. I can't think of a major public project that has ever been delivered on budget and on time.
Yeah.
And, they very often favor prestige projects over bread and butter type projects. I mean, the classic example at the moment, and I know the TPA has been in the lead on trying to do something about this, is HS2, which is an absolute monumental disaster. And I think the figures have just gone up again, haven't they? The cost estimate figures and the
Yeah.
delays.
And they said, the delay, it's not going to be delivered on time again, which is not a
No,
surprise to any of us, as you mentioned as well.
no, the TPA, and I take my hat off to the TPA. You've had a long running campaign on this. I mean, it has sort of worked, hasn't it? Because they've truncated it.
Yeah, the concerning thing about what they've done, though, is kind of the actual productive bit, and the thing that was gaining the returns was the bit from Birmingham and beyond, not the bit from London to Birmingham, because we've already got quite a good train network from here to Birmingham as it is. And so it seemed like a bizarre move to kind of cancel that bit and not the rest of it. But
It was a
I actually
panic
was.
move.
I was actually looking through the capital expenditure for HS2, because they separate it out as its own thing, and they're actually cutting that budget down by 7% in real terms annually. And so that was quite an interesting decision in themselves. I mean, I was listening to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones, on
Yes.
Politics Live, kind of straight after the review, and he was saying that it's kind of a case study for how things shouldn't be delivered by the government. But as you say, the concerning thing is we hear this every single time after a government project, and it
We
doesn't
do.
seem to be, if there are any lessons for them, that they certainly haven't learned them at least. Um, I did want to ask you as well, Mike, actually, what I found interesting, certainly from recent spending reviews where this hasn't happened, is the government did actually announce that they'd done this zero-based review, as they call it, kind of going through the books in full as they were announcing and kind of rooting out any areas of wasteful spending, really. And I think it's kind of procured them, they're saying 14 billion a year by the end of the forecast period, which is 2028, 29 for this. And so, I mean, I'd be interested in your views on that, because, I mean, my takeaway from it was, okay, great, they're doing this, but also they've said is, okay, we're going to find 14 billion and then we're going to reinvest it in public spending anyway. I mean, we've got a tax burden which is already reaching a record high, and they're not going to reinvest any of it in actually doing a tax cut for them. And so I was kind of interested in your view on that, because I'm sure this isn't the first zero-based review that you've come across.
No. I mean, there have been these reviews really pretty well throughout my adult life, and I think one of the most well known in the more recent past is the Gershon review that was commissioned by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown back in the early noughties. Peter Gershon, very successful businessman, was brought in and he reviewed right across the piece on public spending. And he came up with an estimate that they had saved £20 billion by various changes that had been made, which in today's terms would be about 50 billion. So not to be sniffed at. But unfortunately, when the National Audit Office subsequently investigated these savings, they found that a lot of it just couldn't be proved at all. There'd been quite a bit of deck chair rearranging so that something that was taken out of one budget put in another one. One notorious example was hospitals were saving money by speeding up discharges for patients. But unfortunately, a lot of these patients then had to be brought back to hospital because they weren't well enough to be discharged. And we're laughing about it. But I mean, this is people's lives we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So there were a whole lot of stuff like that. So at the end of the day, the National Audit Office said, well, we've only got, we can only demonstrate a quarter of these savings as being real. And that's fairly typical of all of these sorts of things.
No, Mike, and you're absolutely right on that. I mean, when we look at the departmental administration budget in this spending review as well, I think it was kind of down around about 16%, the government's forecasting within this review period, just for the administration department. And I think that sounds great. Obviously, the TPA, we talk about these things all the time. Let's cut out some of the back office costs so that then funds can either be spent on frontline services or just the priority can be on the frontline services as well. But as you mentioned with the NAO report, the thing is, these saving announcements are made, but then they're not really followed up. And the thing is, they sound too good to be true. Like 16% is a great announcement, but where are they actually going to find this from? And ultimately, even if they do find it, what are they actually going to spend that saving on? Because ultimately, if it's just going to wash around effectively just into another part of the public sector, then effectively, from my perspective at least, there's little benefit in doing that unless it's allocated to specific capital spending, which is going to see a return on it. If not, it should be fundamentally put into a tax cut, which is going to stimulate part of the economy. It could be quite a targeted tax cut if they wanted, and that would actually reduce the tax burden on everyone else and also potentially stimulate the economy, which is notionally what the government says it wants to do.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I mean, where do these savings go? I think the other interesting thing, because this was one of the other strategic objectives set out in the spending review, to achieve value for money. And they've set up, as we know, a so-called Office for Value for Money inside the Treasury. And the Treasury Select Committee, which is chaired by a Labour MP, of course,
Yeah.
really ripped this thing to shreds back earlier in the year. Because, first of all, it's only got 12 people in it, which is not really enough to do anything serious when you're looking across the whole of Whitehall. Second, the head of it is only there for a year.
Yeah.
And third, there's no sort of, well, they say they've changed some of this, but I doubt it. Exactly to the point you've made. There was no framework set up for monitoring implementation and following these things through. And they've talked about also. I mean, to be honest, I got a bit confused when they were talking in the spending review about how much they were actually spending, because you mentioned the 16% figure, and that was for the administration budget.
Yeah.
But then they talk about a 5% figure that has to be delivered by all departments across Whitehall. Quite how it's going to be delivered, I don't know, but that was a broader type of thing. So, it could be quite a lot of money. I think the thing about waste is that, the TPA has been focusing on waste ever since it's been in existence, quite rightly. There's massive amounts of waste in the public sector. We all know this. And in principle, there must be ways of doing things more efficiently. I mean, 6 months ago, or maybe less, I tried to do a calculation of how much our government wastes overall. And I came to a figure of 200 billion, which is, quite a lot of money. Now, that was based on a high level analysis that one of the world's leading experts on comparative government performance had done. And what that represented was his estimate of how far behind in terms of efficiency, that's relating outputs of government to the inputs, the cost of the inputs and what it actually delivers, how far behind we are from the world's leaders. Now, it must be said that no government around the world is super efficient. So this is behind a bar that's not as high as it could be. And, basically, he came to the conclusion that we were about 15% below where the world's best are. And the world's best are countries, the particular countries he mentioned were Switzerland, Japan, Canada, and the US. And the US is interesting because a lot of people in the US, like Elon Musk, feel that a lot of money is wasted there. And yet, when you look at that input-output ratio, that sort of cost benefit, as it were, they're ahead of us by about 15%. And 15% is about, 200 billion.
Well, it's nice to see as well that these other countries, though, aren't just sitting on their laurels to an extent and saying, look at us, we're super efficient. They're actually finding other areas that they can cut down as well. The concerning thing is, I mean, government by its nature, to some extent, is going to be more inefficient than the private sector. That's just part and
Yeah,
parcel of the game that it's in. But ultimately, 200 billion, just to put that into kind of our viewers' kind of minds and what that could pay for, that's more than we spend on the entire NHS at the minute. It's kind of the
it
entire
is.
NHS budget we're wasting on a range and raft of things. And I think on that, when you put it in those terms, Mike, it does actually show that this isn't a small area that they could tackle. Because quite a lot of the time, what people say is, oh, well, that's just a million here, a million there. It's not going to add up to anything in the grand scheme of a government's budget. But 200 billion is an enormous amount of money in anyone's perspective. And there is a massive amount that they could actually use that money on. I mean, let alone tax cuts. Let's just think, as I say, about spending. Think about what they could actually spend that money instead. I mean, we're talking about defence at the minute. I mean, that would balloon our defence budget up way beyond the 3% or the 5% that Donald Trump is wishing us to do right now. But I think that the issue is that there just isn't the political weight behind wanting to really deliver it. I mean, you mentioned the Office for Value for Money there. Sounds great. I don't think it will be as great as many others, including yourself, has mentioned. I mean, 12 people, I don't think that even is the size of the amount of SPADs there are in number 10, let alone the full weight of the civil service across Whitehall. And so, I mean, they have my best wishes in delivering what they can, but I haven't got high hopes for what they're actually going to deliver. And we've seen in the past these great sounding quangos, but that then actually when they actually get set up, they get involved in the group thing and they end up actually just costing taxpayers money rather than actually delivering any of the savings that they're supposed to. And I think in that context, Mike, to an extent, is it the case that the government really needs to potentially focus on waste? Yes, but it's also going to have to make some big, difficult decisions on spending because ultimately,
Well,
sorry, Mike, do you want to jump in?
no, I think it is going to have to make big decisions. But just to loop back on that 200 billion, you're right. It could be used to spend on other stuff, or it could be used for tax cuts.
Yeah.
And if we took that 200 million, because I worked out the numbers, you could halve income tax and you could have enough left over to abolish inheritance tax and stamp duty.
Sounds good.
Done.
Yeah, sounds good to me. I mean, I'm not sure why they don't do it. This is clearly going to be a vote winner if they decide to.
Well, no, well that's absolutely right. And but there's another point. You're right. The key thing is you can sort of tinker around at the edges, and we've tried to do this, consistently. This is not the first government to do it. The Thatcher government did it as well, and it was a similar result. They came up with a number. They too got the head of Marks and Spencers in, a guy called Derek Rayner, to do it. He came up with a number, I can't remember what it was, but it was quite chunky. And when they examined it afterwards, they found that only a quarter had been delivered. That seems to be like an immutable kind of law, that only a quarter will be delivered. It's worth having. If the value for money office manages to do that, which I doubt, it would still be worth having. But it's not really tackling the big problem. The big problem is only going to be tackled, as you say, if governments are prepared to make some big decisions. And one point I'd make about that 200 billion is was not just looking at the output of government, it was looking at various conditions across the economy. For example, healthcare. It looked at how well healthcare was being delivered in our country compared to other countries. Well, of course, we're basically the only, well, Canada's a bit different, but basically we're the only country that has a nationalized healthcare system. And our sort of cost benefit ratio on that system is terrible. Well, I mean, what they say is, look, voters, people in the country, what they want is the end result. They don't actually care whether it's delivered by the government or by a or by that, well, let's say a social insurance system where you have a multiplicity of suppliers and people. There's an element of choice and competition, and also it's fair to say co-payment. It's a different system. It delivers much better results, much more bang for the buck than our nationalized system. So one thing that needs desperately looking at, and governments have fought shy of doing this for as long as I can remember. There needs to be a serious look at whether we should break up the National Health Service and move to, let us say, a European social health insurance system. Because you can still provide universal care. You can still, for people who really can't afford the premiums on their insurance policies, you can have that tax funded, and all the countries do that for a mix. But I mean, without going into the detail of that, that is one big decision that needs looking at that could improve efficiency quite a lot. But of course, there are other decisions as well. I mean, so 20% of government spending is health basically, and around a third is what is known as social protection, which is basically welfare spending, but it's also got adult social care wrapped in there as well.
Yeah.
And, together, those two areas basically comprise 50% of public spending. And both of those areas need a radical overhaul. And, the trouble is both areas are very, very difficult. I mean, we saw, for example, what happened to Theresa May in 2017, when midway through the election campaign, there was this announcement that, the death tax or the dementia tax, whatever it was called, was going to make old people pay more for their care rather than the taxpayer paying for it. Well, I mean, that's an area that anyone who's ever really looked at this with any degree of seriousness, going all the way back to Andrew Dilnot and his report about 15 years ago, knows that essentially we have to move to a system where individuals pay for more of their basically nursing home and old people's home type care. And yet, any government that tries to do it is very, very difficult. But without making those big decisions, I think we're stuck.
Yeah, I mean, and you've kind of laid out the big two areas that I was going to cover as well. I mean, in terms of health, these are not America is always touted as the alternative option. No
It's
one, I
not.
don't think, across
It's
the
not.
entire country is ever
No.
going to say we should do the American style system. There are plenty of European examples, France, Germany, the Netherlands that run
The
this sort of model.
Netherlands.
Also, Australia as well. They have a hybrid
Mm.
system where you have kind of base level care for everyone, and then there's tax relief to encourage people to actually purchase enhanced private health insurance as well. And so there are lots of alternative options other than the government stumping up the entire bill itself, which is just becoming unsustainable. And I think the thing we're seeing recently, and obviously COVID enhanced this as well, is that it's costing a lot of money, and the actual results from it are not worth the amount of money we're putting in as well. I mean, we're doing some big research at the minute on healthcare productivity, and we're not
Right.
even back to the level that we were before the pandemic. And so the
No.
chances that we're going to be able to really add lots more value to this public nationalized health system, I think is frankly for the birds at the minute. And then, as you mentioned, I think the biggest area, and this is getting a lot of discussion in Westminster, obviously the NHS is generally seemed as untouchable by those with political power, even though, I mean, we had Steve Baker, just on a side note, in our podcast last week, and he was actually saying now that he's not an MP anymore, he is a lot more free to actually say that there does need to be a lot more
I
involvement
saw it.
potentially for the private sector. So that's an interesting take now that he's no longer a member of Parliament, but welcome to hear as well that those views are being expressed. But going back onto welfare, I think that is the big area which is getting a lot of attention right now, because as you say, it's a third of all expenditure by the government. And actually, it's another big area that really didn't get much attention in this spending review, because for our viewers' awareness, kind of spending reviews focus on two elements. You've got resource departmental expenditure limits, which is kind of departments' day-to-day expenditure costs. And then you've got capital expenditure limits as well, which is their investment into different departments. But what it doesn't mention is the third really key part on this, which is annually managed expenditure, which is money the government spends spends, but which is fluctuates because it's demand led. And a lot of the welfare bill is obviously annually managed expenditure because it's state pensions, it's other benefits that they're paying out as well. And without addressing that area, it's frankly going to be impossible to actually resolve our public finances crisis. Because, I mean, we mentioned earlier when it comes to the real national debt, I believe the state pension accounted for about 6 trillion of our real national debt liability. So about half of it's just there. And without tackling that, I know Kemi Badenoch said she's looking into it potentially to change policy on that, but without tackling that, it's fundamentally going to be impossible to get a grip on some of these budgets.
I think that's absolutely right. And the pension area is an interesting one, isn't it? Because obviously it's highly contentious, and we all know that all we old people, we all vote for people who are going to keep the pensions going and all that sort of thing.
Of course,
Whereas
yeah.
people like you, Darwin, are trying to find ways of anyway. But I mean, there's a real we can see there's a political problem there, but there's another problem as well. So when you look at the scale of the numbers that we're dealing with, right? I mean, so if we put some numbers on this, I said right at the start that I thought that public spending at around 35% of GDP was sustainable as a long-term proposition. And as you say, no one wants to abolish public spending. There are all sorts of things that we need to have done. Fine. I think 45% is not sustainable. If we could get back to 35%, I think everything would be fine. It's a big if. The amount of money involved in terms of today's GDP and everything would be about 280 billion. So it's quite a lot. It's more than that 200 billion I
Yeah,
quoted to you earlier on.
yeah.
Okay, well, that's fine. But then you start thinking about some of the actual things you could do. And so if we focus on pensions, right, there are a couple of obvious things to do. One, increase the state pension age again. I mean, it's already slated to go up to 2028 before the end of this decade. 68 before the end of this decade.
Yeah.
But I think it has to go up to 70 at least. That's my personal brutal view.
Mm.
Fine. But actually, according to the OBR, if you increase the state pension age by 1 year, it doesn't save hundreds of billions. It saves about 10 billion. It's better than a kick in the teeth, but it's not, not
Not
on
a
the
bad
scale of
dollar.
things.
Yeah.
So even if you put it up to 70, that's you're maybe going to save another 20 billion. And I think it has to be done.
Mm.
But there are other things that would need doing as well. Similarly, with the triple lock, there's a lot of talk about abolishing the triple lock. Now, I've looked around for a kind of official estimate of what that's cost us so far, and I haven't found one. Maybe you have, but I have seen an estimate that the cumulative cost, i.e., if we'd never had the triple lock, but had stuck with price indexation, which is what we had before it was introduced, then basically the pension bill will be about 10 billion a year less now than it was then. Does that does that ring a bell with you, Darwin?
Yeah, that latter figure certainly does. And I think, as you say, kind of 10, 20 billion here and there, that's obviously massively welcomed wherever it can
Yeah.
be done. But as you say, kind of the scale of the problem is not going to be solved just by doing that. And I think obviously pensions is one aspect of the kind of welfare bill that is managed by the Department for Work and Pensions. But the other side of things as well is actually, yes, benefits. And I mean, I
Yeah.
was looking at the ONS analysis. They released it back in December, but it's pertinent, I think, still now in that 52% of all UK individuals are now actually net beneficiaries of the state, which means that they're receiving more in benefits than they're actually paying in taxes. I mean, and I think fundamentally for our viewers that's not sustainable either fiscally, like we simply cannot afford that, but also politically, because we cannot sustain our social contract with over half of our population being reliant on the benefit system. And ultimately, what needs to happen is we need to reset really and figure out, okay, what are the areas that we want to target and prioritize and focus on for our benefit expenditure? And we will focus on those. But what we can't do is have a system which is loose and allows lots of people who they may have conditions that do require support, but that fundamentally we cannot afford to continuously pay for in the long term because it is just becoming completely unaffordable for us to actually pay for that.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, Darwin. I mean, and none of the things we're talking about now are easy decisions. We
Of
we
course.
understand that.
Yeah.
But, to save big money, I mean, the welfare bill has to be tackled. I mean, there are other things that could be done, and would not be popular. I mean, at the moment, our welfare system defines the poverty line as 60% of median income. But the OECD's official definition and our definition used to be 50%, which seems like kind of, to me, a more intuitive type of thing to do. Now,
Yeah.
if you did that, I can't remember the numbers now, but we have done calculations on this in the past. You would save quite a lot of money if over a period of time you actually said, right, we're going to redefine the poverty line. I think that, I mean, was it Churchill talking about, we needed a safety, welfare should be a safety net. And I think we all agree with that. We don't want anyone starving in the streets. We want people to have a standard of living and to be able to survive in our society. But, I mean, 60% of median income sounds pretty ambitious to me. I mean, it's more of a kind of, it's more of a sort of equality type issue rather than a poverty alleviation issue. And I think we need to rethink that.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. Like, no one obviously kind of gets some sort of relish of having to make these sort of decisions. But the way I've always looked at it, and I think the way we should all be looking at it, including the government, is that these aren't decisions we want to take, but that we have to make them fundamentally, because ultimately, if our finance is going to ruin and we have to call in the IMF to actually help us out, these are going to be decisions that are forced upon us, and they're actually going to be even harsher than we may have to do right now, because we're going to need to get ourselves out of the fiscal position we've put ourselves in. And so fundamentally, to save ourselves from having to be even harsher than we have to be, it does mean that those difficult decisions have to be taken right now. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure, Mike, in terms of, are there any other specific kind of policy areas you'd look at that potentially could
Well,
have
I
significant
tell you,
savings?
there's another area that would save quite a lot of money. I mean, I know it's not as bad as it used to be, but the
Mm,
fact of the matter is that every time I have looked at public sector pay, including the pensions entitlement against private sector pay,
yeah,
there's still a huge gap.
yeah,
Now, I think we could save a lot of money there. I mean, one of the first things, of course, Rachel Reeves did when she came in was she bunged a load of money into public sector pay. Obviously, the Labour Party continues to be largely funded by the unions, and these days, unions basically means public sector unions.
yeah.
So, yeah, she bunged in, I mean, from memory, I think it was the best part of 10 billion or something like that to equalize up public sector pay, as she put it. But to my mind, it didn't need equalizing because it was already higher than private sector pay. So I think that is another area where, we have to look to see if we can make some savings. And whereas it's difficult to kind of winnow out the jobs, I mean, you can either to cut down the public sector pay bill, you either cut the number of jobs or you cut pay,
Yeah.
or you depress the growth of pay. We have had pay freezes, but it still hasn't quite done the trick. Well, cutting jobs, I think we definitely need to do that, but that's a far harder proposition, as Elon Musk found out with Doge, because you could never be entirely sure, from the top what might go. You could throw the baby out with the bathwater very easily if you're not careful. But depressing pay or bringing it into line with the private sector ought to be a fairly straightforward thing to do, I would have thought.
Yeah, and I think they didn't really mention that at all in this spending review, because obviously it's great to hear for the health service that they're going to be getting 30 billion more. That's great for them. But how much of that is actually going to be taken up then when it comes to pay increases over this time period as well? It wasn't that long ago that we had strikes about pay across the public sector, really. And so how much of these additional budgets are actually going to be taken up on just paying people who you've already got? And then I think the fundamental thing for me is that we don't have the politicians that are willing to make the difficult decisions that are required. Just going back to what we were saying before, we were just talking about welfare and spending. And we obviously, a large argument ever since the government really came in was the winter fuel payments that they cut. And the thing is, I think that accounted for about 0.4% of welfare spending alone, and the amount of political heat that they got in return for that they actually forced a U-turn on a government of this size, with a majority of the size that it has, shows that the concern is not that I want to be a pessimist, going back to what we were saying at the start, but ultimately I don't know how we can feel much else at the minute, because what they're doing is not taking the decisions that they are being elected to do, which is to actually steward our public finances responsibly. And what they're doing is just continuing to borrow, continuing to tax, and until they actually get out of that mindset, then there isn't going to be a way out for us. And I think kind of a final area to discuss really, Mike, is the budget that's coming up obviously in the autumn. We've talked a lot about the spending review, and the way I kind of termed it in the podcast after the spending review was that this is going to be further taxpayer austerity really come the budget. How do you feel about it? Because my view is that come the budget, the growth is not great for this year anyway. They haven't actually funded how they're doing the winter fuel U-turn as well. And so what they're going to have to come back and do in the autumn is they're going to have to come for a tax grab as well. And because of their manifesto commitments, meaning that they can't increase taxes on income tax, employee national insurance, or VAT, it's going to mean they're going to come back on investment taxes, which is going to hit the growth markers that they are laying down for themselves. But maybe you have a different opinion.
I'm afraid I wish I had a different opinion than Darwin, but I'm afraid I don't. I mean, I think the public finances would have certainly deteriorated further since the OBR's March forecast. They really have very little options. I mean, I think Rachel Reeves has described her fiscal rules as being non-negotiable or words to that effect. Now, I happen to think, and I think we touched on this earlier on, that her fiscal rules are incredibly weak. But even those fiscal rules are going to be difficult to stick to with what is likely to come out of the revised forecasts, I think. And she's almost certainly going to have to. I mean, it's not beyond the possibility that she would change her fiscal rules again, of course. And I don't believe that the gilt market, for example, places much store on these rules because they're constantly changing and they're very weak. So I don't think it would make a whole lot of difference to the markets if she did abandon them. But of course, the only real area she can move on to change the basic numbers is tax, unless, setting aside emergency spending cuts, which is what we were talking about earlier on in the 70s with Callahan. But setting aside a crisis before the budget, I think it has to be spending cuts. And as you say, she's limited herself to what she can do. So it's probably another whack on, in one way or another, investment and business operations, which is the very last thing we need. So I don't know. They say Dubai is not too bad, actually, Darwin. I don't know if you've considered it.
Certainly the weather's good, so maybe if I want the weather we're experiencing right now all year round, maybe I'll have a look. But like I said, I think they're certainly not. Just to sum up, Mike, they're not doing what they said when they came into office, which is they
They're
said
not.
they were getting elected to fix the
They're
public
not.
finances. And as we've clearly done in this, or shown in this conversation, is they're not doing that. Things are getting worse, and they're getting worse on their watch now. And for the next 4 years going forward, they are not going to have the Conservatives to blame when the numbers continue to get worse, as we both certainly expect them to do. But what I want to do, Mike, is thank you for that. This has been quite a tour de force, I think, across the spending review, and it will be
Well,
interesting to see what comes up in the budget. But thank you for this, and hopefully speak soon.
well, thank you, Darwin. And I hope that next time we speak, we'll have been proved completely wrong and Rachel Reeves will have got a grip on things. We'll
Fingers
see.
crossed. Fingers crossed. Thank you very much, Mike.
So long. Bye.